the record reflect, we are back in session. Parties and counsel are present. Our jurors are not yet present. Counsel indicated you wanted to address something before the next witness is called.
It's my understanding that defense has an objection to the next witness that the people are calling based on a financial transaction that occurred.
This isn't, go ahead.
Well, we're not objecting to the calling of a witness. I believe what they want to do, the people want to do, is call up a detective who subpoenaed bank records to lay the foundation for bank records.
That's incorrect. Those records are already admitted because they were done pursuant to a search warrant, so those records are already admitted.
Then,
What we are establishing, Your Honor, is calling Detective Smith to basically talk about the record that defense counsel got into with that witness, with the $62.50 deposit and a $5,000 wire transfer that was made out immediately after that into the defendant's bank account.
well, so what they want to do is offer Ryan Smith as an expert on bank records and an expert on the finances involving Mr. Merritt and EIP. I have, one, no report to say he's qualified to do that. Two, I have no foundation that he can actually get up and do it. What they want to do is have Mr. Smith, after they have their meeting in the back, we need you to get on the stand and say X, Y, and Z. So now can you get on the stand and say that without any foundation? So,
Well, he can't get up and just read what the bank records say. The bank records, if they show whatever they show, speak for themselves.
that's our position.
We just want to introduce that particular transaction through him, Your Honor. That he viewed a transaction on Mr. Kavanaugh's account with a wire transfer out directly into the defendant's bank account.
He can't lay the foundation when the transaction started, when it was completed, if it was done before or after. They want to insinuate that.
It says it in the records.
Well, the record is the evidence.
All right, then we can just show the record, Your Honor.
Sure, you can let the foundation that it was obtained through a search warrant or a subpoena DT or wherever they were obtained from, and then you can show what the record shows, sure.
Okay.
But there could be no comments by counsel. There could be no explanation of what they're looking at. This is not closing argument. If they don't have a witness that's before the court to say, hey, here's an exhibit, what does this exhibit show you? They just want to say, Your Honor, we want to publish exhibit 755, or whatever they name it to the jury. They can look through the bank records all they want. They can't highlight what to look at. They can't tell them what page to look at, because that would be argument, that would be direction. And they're not allowed to do that. Yes.
Actually, they
Just a minute.
That is what...
I said just a minute.
Okay.
They can show whatever records they want. They can highlight whatever portion of the records they want. I agree with you, they cannot call a detective to then read what does that record say or what does it show.
If they're allowed to highlight evidence at this stage without a witness, then that is a closing argument.
The problem,
All right, I disagree with that.
and just,
Because there would be no witness that we would get to cross-examine then, or to address that issue they're presenting to the jury. We get to stand up then afterward and say, we don't know what date this started. Wire transfers take time for them to go through, usually 24 hours to be processed, sometimes
No.
72.
If there's a,
That's the
they can
problem.
show whatever records they want.
to clarify the record, Your Honor, the defendant's Bank of America records were already deemed admissible by this court in an eliminated motion based on the fact they complied with 1560C and that they were obtained by a search warrant and contained a sufficient custodian of records affidavit. So therefore, those exhibits have already been deemed admitted. This witness is simply explaining the connection between two different exhibits, one that was used by Mr. Moline and one that's being proffered by the people from those records. And as you mentioned, highlight certain things that are contained within the document, and that is it. He's not rendering an opinion. He's not offered as an expert.
Any testimony would be irrelevant. This is closing. That's what closing arguments for.
Well, you can show whatever exhibits you want to show. You can highlight whatever you want to highlight within the exhibit. I don't know about the detective then reading what the exhibit shows or saying, well, this exhibit shows whatever he believes it shows. The exhibit speaks for itself.
And we agree with that. It's
Okay.
just a way for the jury to understand the exhibits. That's it.
Okay.
I just want to make clear, how is people going to be allowed to highlight any part of the exhibit to the jury, because they would be barred from speaking to them directly?
The same way you do with all of your exhibits. You highlight and focus on one part of the exhibit.
Okay, with a witness on the stand. There's going to be no witness on the stand. There's not going to be directing questions, anything. What the court's saying is you can address this to the jury personally, and that's not allowed outside of closing or opening.
They can put on, they can demonstrate and show to the jury any exhibits that there's a sufficient foundation for. If there are records that were obtained pursuant to subpoena, DP, or a search warrant, where there is a sufficient foundation, they can show those to the jury.
Then the defense's request would be that the court instruct the jury, we have received an exhibit, the exhibit is now being asked to publish to you for your review, in the court address and not the prosecution. So the court can say, do with it as you wish, or however, that must be presented to the
The
jury.
people are entitled to say that they wish to show the jury exhibit so-and-so, which is obtained from pursuant to a search warrant.
That I don't have an objection to, as long as they're not trying to describe or tell them what to look at.
Okay.
Your Honor, I would say that if they're going to do this with, because what they're going to do is they're going to put on a bank record, and I don't know how the court's going to allow them to highlight it through a detective who doesn't have any knowledge of the transaction.
No, the detective can't. He's
Well,
not.
I have a feeling that's what they're going to do. And it'll be too late, the bell would have been rung, and we'll be sitting here not without a witness to cross-examine as to what those transactions
All right, I
are.
already said what they can and can't do.
Can I be heard?
Sure.
That's ridiculous, because he showed somebody that wasn't a party to the bank record an exhibit and had him highlight a certain portion of it. So to say we can't put up an exhibit that's properly admitted with a foundation, unlike he had when he showed this last witness, that we can't highlight is absurd. We should be allowed to put up that record, that particular transaction, zoom in on it, and show the jury that exhibit and that page of that exhibit.
I agree with that, and I
Okay,
sustained the people's objection to Mr. Moline referring to the records and stating what those records were. I sustained their objection to that. I allowed the witness to review any document to see if that document, whatever it was, refreshed their recollection. But I sustained your objection to Mr. Moline's description of the document, and I sustained your objections to the witness offering any speculations to what the records were.
I believe he testified that it represented a transaction of $62.50.
He did, Your Honor. He went through the record and identified, and
Well,
Mr. Moline
he was utilizing the two exhibits that were records of their company.
No.
The invoice and the receipt to show that there was a payment of a deposit of $62.50, and you utilized other exhibits to show the checks that went to Mr. Merritt and Ms. Jarvis and Sheet Metal Company.
Your Honor, Mr. Moline approached Mr. Martin when he was on the stand and showed him Exhibit 438 and had him specifically read that this bank record belonged to Dan Kavanaugh and it showed a deposit of
I sustained
$6,250.
the
You did not,
people's
we didn't
objection.
object to it, Your Honor, and he got that information in, we didn't object to that.
Well, I recall sustaining the objection when Mr. Moline referred to what the bank record was. If you didn't object to it, that doesn't make something else that would otherwise be inadmissible admissible. I've already ruled what you can do with the exhibit, all right? So we can bring our jurors in and you can proceed. Witness. Or present your next exhibits, whatever.
Your Honor, at this time, the people would ask permission to publish exhibit number 438, a copy of the document that Mr. Maloney showed to Mr. Martin on recross examination.
I'm sorry, what exhibit was that?
438.
Okay,
Was then verified by Ms. Rodriguez on redirect.
okay.
That's not you. Okay. Page 2. Now I'd ask the court's permission to publish 436A, copy of the defendant's bank statement from March 15th of 2010 that was previously ruled admissible via a search warrant.
Those were records that were obtained pursuant to the execution of the search warrant from Mr. Merritt's records?
Correct.
Okay. What exhibit is that?
I believe I said 436A. Yes. Specifically, the second page of that document, multi-page document. reference, I'm gonna put back up 438. Actually, I'm gonna do this. Yes. This way. Thank you, Your Honor.
And retrospect that we've shown exhibit 438 and exhibit 436A were shown to the jurors. And we're ready to call your next witness.
Yes, Your Honor, at this time, the people would call Dr. Changsri.
Do you solemnly state the evidence shown in this matter is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes.
You state your full name, spell it for the record.
Dr. Chanikarn Changsri, Chankarn, Changsri.
Spell it one more time.
Both of them?
Yes.
Chankarn, last name is Changsri.
Okay, you may proceed.
Thank you. What is your current occupation?
I am the Chief Forensic Pathologist for the San Juan County Sheriff's Department, Coroner's Division.
How long have you been a forensic pathologist at the San Bernardino County Coroner's Division?
For 13 years.
How long have you been the chief?
For 2 years.
And prior to that, did you work as a forensic pathologist at any other agency?
Yes, at the Los Angeles County Medical Examiner's Office.
How long did you work there as a forensic pathologist?
Approximately 2 years.
Could you explain to us what a forensic pathologist does?
A forensic pathologist reviews the history and circumstances surrounding the death. We perform autopsies and any tests necessary in order to determine the cause of death and manner of death.
Could you describe your educational background in terms of being a forensic pathologist?
I have a doctorate degree in medicine. I completed an internship in pediatric. I completed a residency program in anatomic and clinical pathology. I completed a fellowship program in forensic pathology, and I am board certified in anatomic pathology, clinical pathology, and forensic pathology.
Other than what you've just described to us, do you have any other specialized training in terms of being a forensic pathologist?
No.
And then I think you mentioned that you are board certified. Could you describe for us any specific licenses or certificates that you hold?
So I have a medical license from the state of California. As I stated earlier, I'm board certified in anatomic and clinical pathology and forensic pathology.
Now, as the chief medical examiner, do you have any additional responsibilities?
Yes, I supervise and oversee the other doctors. I also give lectures and do administrative work.
In terms of giving lectures and not the administrative work, but in terms of giving lectures, who do you provide lectures to?
Currently to the Coroner's Division.
Do you participate in any continuing education?
Yes, as part of to continue to be board certified, we have to do continuing medical education and retake the board exam every 10 years.
Now, do you provide any training other than the lectures that you just described to us?
No.
Approximately how many autopsies do you conduct on an annual basis?
On an annual basis, anywhere from 400 to 500?
Now, is that you individually?
Yes.
And has that number stayed pretty consistent since you've been with the county?
Yes.
Have you previously examined remains that are skeletonized?
Yes.
And have you examined remains that are skeletonized with blunt force trauma?
No, I have not.
So the previous cases where you've examined skeletonized remains, they have not had blunt force trauma?
Correct.
Have you previously examined cases that have had blunt force trauma?
Yes.
Can you describe for us some of the different types of blunt force trauma injuries that you have sustained to the head?
Blunt force trauma that you sustain to the head is the same as blunt force trauma anywhere in the body. So let's first start off with the outer layer, which is your skin. There's 3 types of blunt force trauma that you can see on soft tissue. Contusion, which is a bruise, an abrasion, which is a scrape of the skin, and a laceration. A laceration is an open wound that involves your skin and the underlying tissue, but there's still soft tissue connecting both sides. After that, you can also have broken bones or any other injuries to the underlying organs.
Now, will all those different types of blunt force trauma that you described actually cause exterior bleeding? And when I say exterior bleeding, I'm talking about to the skin level.
The only one that would cause significant bleeding is the laceration.
So if I understand you correctly, you can actually sustain blunt force trauma to your head, but not actually bleed on the exterior of your head.
If you don't have a laceration or an open skull fracture, then the bleeding would be contained in the head because of the skull. It's encased in the skull.
Is it possible to have skull fractures to the head with no lacerations?
Yes.
So if someone has blunt force trauma to the head with no actual lacerations, what type of injuries might you see to the head?
So these type of cases, they're most commonly seen in child abuse. And that's what makes child abuse difficult, because the skin of a child is more elastic and pliable, so it would absorb the energy and the force will actually go to break the skull or cause injury to the brain itself. So in cases of child abuse, of head trauma, what you see on the skin is actually just bruises.
And what would you see underneath the skin for head trauma?
So underneath the skin, you will see bleeding underneath the skin, and then you also can see skull fractures and bleeding in the skull itself.
Does part of what you can have occur in terms of blunt force trauma to the head, can you also have swelling of the brain?
Yes, any injury to the brain will cause swelling to the brain.
Can you have that swelling of the brain without an actual laceration to the outside?
Yes, in cases of where you don't have a laceration, as I said, in child abuse, where you have skull fractures, or you have direct injury to the brain, or bleeding in the head itself, but it's encased in the skull, you can have swelling of the brain.
So when you see blunt force trauma to the head, are those things that you typically will encounter when you're looking at that? I'm sorry, that's probably a really bad question. You described some of the different circumstances that you can see with head trauma. Some of the ones we just talked about with the swelling to the brain and things like that. Are those things that you see in an autopsy where you don't have skeletonized remains? And there's head trauma.
Can I read back the question to you to make sure I understand it?
Sure.
Are you asking what type of trauma I see in the head if I don't see laceration on the scalp?
Yes.
So this extent or severity of the injuries that you see on the scalp is not directly correlated to the injury or the extent of the injuries that are on the skull or on the brain. So you can have multiple bruises, lacerations, and no skull fractures, and no bleeding to the brain. And vice versa, you can have bleeding in the brain and have one laceration, or you can have no bleeding in the brain with a skull fracture and with some external trauma. So one does not mean you will see the other, it's the same severity. Besides the bleeding from the laceration on the scalp, you will have skull fractures. Now when you have multiple skull fractures, you can have bleeding in the different layers of the brain. You can have cerebral contusions, which means the bleeding goes into the brain tissue itself. So it's like when you have a bruise on your arm, you have a bruise in the brain. So that's the direct injury to the brain. You can also have a fracture laceration, which is common in multiple skull fractures, which is when the skull has broken into multiple pieces and a broken piece pierced into the tissue of the brain itself.
Now, what is the normal procedure that you would follow when you do an autopsy?
For a fresh body autopsy, the first thing we do is to x-ray the body, photograph the body. I diagram the body, put it on a body diagram. Then I do an incision on the body and examine the organs inside the body. In cases of skeletal remains, we always have, well, in most cases, we have forensic anthropologists, including myself, doing examination, and we also do x-rays in those cases, before and after the examination.
When you do x-rays and skeletonized remains, what is it that you're looking for?
We are looking for, really, for any foreign object that may be in the bone.
Now, when you conduct an autopsy, does anybody assist you?
We have an autopsy assistant.
And you, I assume, prepare reports in connection with your autopsies?
Yes,
And were you asked to conduct 4 separate autopsies on November 14th and 15th of 2013?
yes.
Who was present during those autopsies?
May I look at my report for recollection?
If that would refresh your recollection.
At the autopsy, including myself, there was Detective Avila, crime scene investigator Aurelio Martinez, and forensic anthropologist Dr. Alexis Gray.
And can you describe how you received the remains for these particular autopsies?
Each case is different. 3 of the cases were in boxes and 1 was in a yellow body bag.
Now, for purposes of your testimony today, the identity of the victims has been stipulated to, but when you did the autopsies, did you have the actual identity of the victims?
No, I did not.
Is that information that you're provided with after the fact and then you go back and supplement your report?
Correct.
Okay. Now, you started with the first autopsy on November 14th of 2013 for Joe Jr., and did you conduct that autopsy in accordance with the process that you just described to us for skeletonized remains?
Yes, I did.
So tell us what you did to actually start the autopsy.
So we received this case in a light cardboard box. We photographed the box open, and photographed the bones that were found in the box.
And did you conduct the x-rays on this particular set of remains?
Yes, we did.
And was there anything unusual about the x-rays?
No.
And then having you look at the remains that we have here, were these the remains that you observed for that first particular autopsy?
Yes.
Can you
And that's
describe?
exhibit number,
Oh, I'm sorry. That would be exhibit number 350, Your Honor.
thank you.
And Your Honor, can we have,
No,
and Your Honor, the defense would object to, again, the notes that the people want to put up on the exhibit, because that's not part of the exhibit.
overruled.
Can you describe for us the condition of the remains?
So you have frontal bones, 3 ribs, and 4 bone fragments All the bones are white, rich, and dried and flaky. There's some brown discoloration on one of the rib and top of the bones.
And moving on to the actual next exhibit, which would be 351, did you find anything significant about this particular portion of the skull that was remaining?
On this frontal bone, we see a circular or half a circle defect on the back right side. The cause of this is unknown. There's also a fracture or broken piece of bone here on the right side, and this fracture determined to be not perimortem.
Okay, so going into this discussion that we've had about antemortem, perimortem, and postmortem, do you have a different definition of that terminology than an anthropologist, an anthropologist would have?
So in cases of fresh bodies, the definition of those three terms are different than in skeletal remains. In a fresh body, your heart is pumping out blood. So when you have injuries to any part of your body, you're going to have bleeding in that area because your heart is pumping. Now, after death, your heart is no longer pumping blood. If you cut a dead body, the dead body is not going to bleed. There's no blood, right, because the heart has stopped bleeding. Perimortem is the same for both, which is the time around the death, a little bit before, during, or after. For skeletal remains, antemortem fractures or antemortem injuries is when there is evidence of bone healing in the fracture because there's no soft tissue, so they cannot use the same criteria. And there has to be healing to call it antemortem because you know that the bone was broken when the person was alive, there was a survivable period, the body was able to repair it. Perimortem fracture is when it occurred around the time of death. Postmortem fractures is when the fracture occurred after the decomposition has already finished.
Okay, so in this particular photograph, and when you examined the remains, you were not able to determine, or were you able to determine when the particular fracture that you noted, were you able to determine the time frame for that?
I determined it to not be a perimortem fracture.
So would that have been postmortem then?
Yes.
You didn't see any evidence of healing in that particular fracture?
No.
And again, you noted a circular indentation on the top of the skull. Are you able to give us any information with respect to the time frame with that? And when I say time frame, I'm referring to ante, peri, and postmortem.
No, and that defect is not necessarily a fracture. It's just it could be a normal variant.
So in this particular case, were you able to determine a cause and manner of death?
Yes, the cause of death is undetermined. The manner of death is homicide.
How is it that you determine it's actually a homicide?
We determine it to be a homicide based on the circumstances surrounding the death.
And is that information that you're provided with prior to conducting the autopsy?
Yes.
Did you next then conduct an autopsy on Gianni McStay?
Yes, I did.
Was that autopsy conducted the same day?
Yes.
And showing you what's been marked as Exhibit 352, can you describe what's depicted in this photo?
This is the skeletal inventory of Gianni, starting from the skull on the right side of the picture down to the long bones on the left side of the picture.
When you received these remains, were they also in a sealed box?
Yes.
And so when you received this sealed box of bones, because these have significantly more than the other autopsy that we just looked at, how do you determine what goes where?
It is determined by Dr. Gray.
So you're only doing one autopsy at a time, is that correct?
Correct.
And so the bones are taken out. Is she the one that places them in position?
Correct.
Okay. Now, showing you what's been marked as People's Exhibit 355 for identification. Can you describe what we're seeing in this particular exhibit?
Can I look at the picture, please? So in this picture, you actually see multiple perinoidum skull fractures. The first one is on the left top side of the head. It's like a shape of a half circle. Then on the left front side, there is a linear fracture down towards the forehead. There's also a open, it's hard to see here because it's dark, but there is a open skull fracture to the back left side of the head.
Backing up just a moment, Your Honor. Okay, showing you what's been marked as Exhibit 354 for identification purposes. Do you recognize this?
Yes, now we're looking at the top of the skull. Again, you see the same half circle fracture here on the left parietal bone. And the area that was dark in the other picture is actually this area, the left back side of the head also looks like a half circle. And you can tell that even though there are no bones in this area, that there was a impact here because of this piece of skull. It's triangular shaped with a circular base that is broken but still attached to it. You also see another fracture here on the sutures, which connects the two bones.
And moving on to Exhibit 353, can you tell us what's depicted in this photo?
In this photo, you're looking at the left back side of the skull. You're getting more of a clear look of the circular shaped fracture with the still attached broken bone.
And moving on to Exhibit 358, if you can tell us what's depicted in that photo.
So for orientation, you're now, the front of the skull is missing. You're looking at the top of the head, and the base of the skull is here on the table. You see that same curvilinear fracture here in the left parietal, but in this photograph you see another fracture that has a curved line. This fracture resulted in the fracture in the suture. It also radiated outward towards the left side. And on the right parietal bone, you see an impact here causing a linear fracture coming up to the fracture on the top of the head.
And moving on to Exhibit 359, can you tell us what's depicted in that photo?
In this photo, you're looking at the right side of the head. For orientation, the right side of the photo is the front of the head, and the base of the skull is facing the ruler. And you're looking at the fracture of the broken skull on the right parietal bone.
Is there anything significant with respect to the discoloration that we see in this photo?
The discoloration is the area of the impact.
And moving on to Exhibit 360, can you tell us what's depicted in this photo?
This is a close-up of the previous picture.
Now, are you able to determine exactly how many impacts or strikes caused these injuries?
Because there's no soft tissue on these bodies, you can't tell exactly how many impacts. Because you can have a force put on your head that doesn't cause skull fractures, and it only causes either bruises or scrapes or laceration, as we talked about. So those are also impact site. So on these cases, I can only say what's the minimum amount of blows to the head that was found based on the fractures that we see on the skull.
And what would that minimum number be?
For this case, the minimum number is 6.
Did you discover anything with respect to the x-rays with this particular victim?
No,
And was there any other trauma that you observed besides the trauma to the skull?
no.
Your Honor, this would probably be a good time actually for us to break if that's okay. I have some additional exhibits I need to get together for the remainder of it.
Okay, we'll take our noon recess a little bit early, take our noon recess till 1:30 this afternoon. Again, keep in mind the admonitions previously given to you, not to form or express any opinions about the case, not to discuss the case. Again, that means not discussing about the case, any of the witnesses, testimony, exhibits, parties, or attorneys, and we'll see everyone back at 1:30.